But I go, can I just try another one? That moment comes and I just go, this is Sparta!
When Gerard Butler stood on that rocky ledge and bellowed the line that would follow him for the rest of his career, nobody watching in a darkened theater in 2007 had any idea what it actually took to get him there. The roar, the muscles, the blood-red cape snapping in the studio wind, all of it looked effortless on screen. But effortless was the last word anyone on set would have used. Years later, Butler has slowly peeled back the curtain on what really happened during the making of 300, and the picture he paints is nothing like the glossy, larger-than-life spectacle audiences fell in love with. It's a story of broken bodies, obsessive preparation, and a group of actors who quite literally suffered together to make a comic book adaptation feel like gospel truth. Today we're going deep into what Butler has actually said about those months in Montreal, the parts that never made it into the trailers. It's easy to forget now, with 300 firmly lodged in pop culture as a meme factory and a fitness inspiration, that when it hit theaters in March of 2007, almost nobody in Hollywood expected it to matter. There was no A-list marquee name carrying the film. Zack Snyder, the director, had exactly one studio picture under his belt at that point, a remake of Dawn of the Dead. The source material was a stylized graphic novel by Frank Miller that told a heavily fictionalized version of the Battle of Thermopylae, not a script built around historical accuracy or award season prestige. Studios treat that kind of project cautiously, and 300 was no exception. It moved forward on a comparatively modest budget of around $60 million, a fraction of what tentpole films were spending at the time. Then it opened, and the numbers stunned everyone. The film pulled in roughly $70 million in its first weekend alone, more than its entire production budget recouped before the second weekend even started. By the time its theatrical run wound down, 300 had grossed well over $400 million worldwide. For a movie built almost entirely on green screens, without a single recognizable movie star headlining it, that kind of return rewired how studios thought about stylized, visually driven action films. It proved audiences didn't need a familiar face to show up in droves, they needed something they'd never quite seen before, and Snyder had given them exactly that. The cultural aftershocks went well past the box office ledger. The image of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, all sculpted abs and crimson capes, became shorthand for a certain kind of masculine physical ideal almost overnight. Gyms across the country started advertising Spartan classes. Fitness magazines ran cover stories breaking down how the cast supposedly got in shape. A single movie had somehow become a workout brand, a meme template, and a box office case study all at once. But none of that tells you what it actually cost the people standing in front of the camera to make it happen, and that's the part Gerard Butler has spent years slowly opening up about. Ask Gerard Butler what he remembers most from filming 300, and it isn't the roaring crowds or the awards buzz. It's the ambulance trips. In interviews given well after the film's release, Butler has been candid that injuries on set weren't the occasional mishap you'd expect from any big action production, they were a near-daily occurrence. He's described turning around mid-fight sequence to see a castmate down on the ground, a dulled but still solid prop weapon having caught someone dangerously close to the eye. In another moment, he recalled, an actor went down hard enough to break his ankle during what should have been a routine choreographed fall. Butler has summed up those days bluntly, saying it felt like someone was being carted off to the hospital on what amounted to a regular basis. Part of what made the set so injury-prone came down to a deliberate choice Snyder made early in the process. Rather than leaning heavily on stunt doubles the way most big battle epics do, he wanted his lead actors performing as much of their own combat work as possible. It's the kind of decision that makes a film look more visceral and grounded. You can often tell on screen when it's genuinely the actor throwing the strike rather than a double standing in for a wide shot, but it comes with an obvious trade-off. Trained stunt performers spend years building the specific body awareness needed to fall, strike, and block safely at speed. Actors, even ones who trained hard, hadn't necessarily built that same muscle memory, and the difference showed up in torn ligaments, deep bruising, and the occasional broken bone. Layer onto that the sheer repetition the production demanded. Battle sequences in 300 weren't shot in a single dramatic take. They required take after take after take, with actors in heavy armor repeating the same violent, high-impact choreography over and over until Snyder had the footage he wanted, all while working in tight, blue screen-lined spaces that left little room to safely maneuver. There was no room for error built into that kind of schedule, and yet mistakes happened constantly because exhausted bodies performing dangerous choreography for the 10th or 12th time inevitably slip. Bruises and cuts became so routine the cast barely mentioned them. What audiences experienced as slow-motion glory on screen was, by Butler's own account, built on a genuinely dangerous production environment that ground the cast down day after day. If the injuries on set were brutal, the months leading up to filming were arguably worse, and they were brutal by design. Long before cameras rolled, Butler and his co-stars were sent into the hands of Gym Jones, a training facility known for a philosophy that treats physical conditioning less like a Hollywood body sculpting program and more like preparation for genuine combat or survival scenarios. The man running that program, strength coach Mark Twight, had a reputation built on mountaineering and endurance sports rather than celebrity fitness, and he brought that same uncompromising mentality into training a room full of actors. Butler has said he trained for roughly 7 months to become Leonidas, with individual sessions sometimes stretching to 6 hours a day. The regimen blended CrossFit-style circuits, heavy weightlifting, sword and combat drills, and conditioning work designed to build not just visible muscle but genuine functional strength, the kind that would let an actor actually swing a blade convincingly for 12 hours on set rather than just look good standing still. Twight sessions reportedly included flipping massive tires, dragging sleds, hauling kettlebells through obstacle course-style circuits, and grinding through pull-ups and push-ups until the cast's arms simply gave out. It wasn't a program built to make the actors look like warriors. It was built to make them move like warriors had to move, because Snyder wanted every ounce of that physical struggle to read as real on camera. The cost of that intensity eventually caught up with Butler's body. He's spoken about developing tendinitis, hip problems, and a torn rotator cuff over the course of training, injuries serious enough that at points he could barely lift his arms above his shoulders. He's used the word ruining to describe what the process was doing to his physical health, and he's been clear that the toll didn't stop once filming began, it simply changed shape. Long days of shooting were followed by continued workouts to keep the cast's physiques camera ready for whatever scene came next, meaning there was effectively no recovery window built into the schedule. Training bled into filming, and filming bled back into training, in a loop that didn't let up for months. Out of that grueling preparation came the workout that would eventually escape the film entirely and take on a life of its own, a punishing 300-repetition circuit built around pull-ups, deadlifts, push-ups, box jumps, and kettlebell work, performed back-to-back with essentially no rest. It became so notorious within the fitness world that gyms across the globe still program versions of it today, and by most accounts only a single member of the cast ever managed to complete the full routine as originally designed on set. Butler himself has admitted that after filming Wrapped, he was too physically drained to seriously train again for well over a year. The workout that inspired an entire subculture of gym-goers had, for the man who actually did it under the harshest conditions, become something closer to a wall he simply couldn't climb again for a long stretch afterward. What separates Butler's account of 300 from a standard actor's suffered for their art story is how far he pushed the preparation past the physical. He's described an almost meditative process of trying to mentally step into the headspace of a man who knowingly led a small force of soldiers toward near-certain death, describing it in interviews as an attempt to channel the character rather than simply perform lines written for him. That's a heavier psychological weight to carry into a role that, on the surface, reads as a straightforward action epic, but Butler has framed it as essential to making Leonidas's conviction feel earned rather than theatrical. That same all-in mentality showed up in his insistence on doing as much of his own stunt work as the production would allow. It wasn't about proving something to an audience, by his own description. It was about the belief that authenticity in a performance comes from actually doing the thing rather than approximating it. He's talked about specific battle sequences where he threw himself so completely into the choreography that the experience became one of the most intense adrenaline rushes of his career, a kind of full physical and emotional investment that's hard to fake on camera even with the best editing in the world. That willingness to put himself in harm's way for a role didn't end with 300 either. Butler has since described dangerous moments on other productions, enduring hypothermia while shooting on location in Iceland, and living through genuinely frightening car stunt work on a later project. Taken together, it paints a picture of an actor whose commitment to physical realism has been a defining, if costly, through line of his entire career, not a one-off gimmick cooked up for a single superhero-adjacent role. Adding another layer of difficulty to the shoot was just how much of the film's violence never actually existed in front of the actors in a physical sense. The vast majority of the blood and gore audiences saw was added digitally after filming Wrapped, meaning the cast had to imagine the visceral aftermath of their own choreography in real time, without practical blood packs or makeup effects to react to. That's a specific and difficult acting challenge. Selling horror, exhaustion, and pain against a blank blue backdrop, with nothing but your imagination and your scene partners to build the moment around. None of the sweeping mythic world of Sparta that audiences saw on screen actually existed anywhere except in post-production. The entire film was shot inside a studio, largely against blue screens, with almost none of the physical sets or location work typical of a historical epic. That approach gave Snyder total control over lighting, weather, and atmosphere, letting him build the graphic novel-inspired look he was chasing frame by frame in visual effects rather than on location. It's part of why the film still looks so distinct nearly 2 decades later, but it came with real physical costs for the people standing under those lights for months on end. The specific lighting setup needed to achieve the film's high contrast, almost painterly color palette generated enormous heat inside an already enclosed studio space, turning the set into an uncomfortably hot environment for actors covered head to toe in heavy armor. Butler has said the conditions eventually caught up with him physically. He's described passing out on set at one point from a combination of dehydration and overexertion, brought on by the punishing combination of heat, weight, and non-stop physical choreography. It's a detail that tends to get lost in behind-the-scenes discussions that focus purely on the visual effects wizardry of the production, but it underlines just how much raw physical strain went into a film that, on screen, looks almost otherworldly and effortless. Even some of the film's most memorable creative choices grew out of improvisation rather than a tightly scripted plan. The Oracle's eerie, fragmented dialogue in the film wasn't entirely written out ahead of time. Much of it was built in the moment to capture a dreamlike, unsettling tone that Snyder wanted for the sequence. It's a small example of a larger truth about the production. For all its visual precision, 300 was still, in places, being figured out on the fly, shaped as much by instinct on set as by anything locked down on the page. Ask Butler about the hardest parts of making 300, and he doesn't only talk about the pain. He talks about what the pain built between him and his co-stars. Alongside actors like Lena Headey, Dominic West, David Wenham, and a then-rising Michael Fassbender, Butler has described the shared grind of training and filming as something that forged a genuine bond among the cast, not just a professional working relationship. Months of brutal workouts done side by side, often in near silence because nobody had the breath left to talk, created a kind of shorthand between them that no amount of rehearsal alone could have produced. That bond, Butler has said, became just as important to selling the film's central theme of Spartan loyalty as any of the choreography or dialogue. When a group of actors has genuinely pushed through exhaustion together, supported each other through injuries, and shared the particular misery of holding a shield formation in blistering studio heat for hours, that lived experience translates onto the screen in ways a purely technical performance can't replicate. He's described feeling like the cast had, in some strange way, already been through a kind of war together long before the cameras started rolling on their scenes as soldiers, an unspoken understanding built entirely out of shared physical hardship. That connection extended past the workouts and into the daily frustrations of the shoot itself. The isolating experience of acting for hours against blank blue screens with no real environment to react to, the discomfort of wearing heavy armor under scorching lights, the fatigue of repeated takes stacking up day after day. Leaning on each other through all of it, by Butler's account, is what turned a physically miserable production into an experience the cast still speaks about fondly, and it's a large part of why the film's depiction of loyalty and brotherhood among the Spartans reads as so convincing on screen. It's rare for a single movie to leave a mark on culture far outside the world of cinema, but 300 managed exactly that. Its aggressive high-contrast visual style, the desaturated color grading, the deliberately theatrical slow motion woven into full-speed combat, the near shot-for-shot devotion to Frank Miller's original panels, became a reference point that other productions openly borrowed from in the years that followed, from stylized historical dramas to prestige fantasy television. Snyder's approach proved that audiences had an appetite for something more heightened and graphic novel-inspired than the grounded historical epics that had dominated the genre before it, and studios took notice. The fitness world absorbed the film just as thoroughly. The training methods developed for the cast filtered out into gyms and fitness media everywhere, spawning countless articles and workout guides built around achieving a Spartan physique. That conversation wasn't purely positive. It also fed into broader cultural debates about unrealistic body standards and the pressure those images placed on young men trying to replicate a look that had taken actors months of 6-hour daily training sessions, expert coaching, and significant physical damage to achieve. The film's influence on how an entire generation thought about strength, masculinity, and physical ideals turned out to be one of its most lasting and most complicated legacies. There was even an unexpected academic ripple. The film's dramatized take on the Battle of Thermopylae sent a wave of curious viewers toward the actual historical record, and interest in classical texts covering the period saw a noticeable bump in the years following the film's release. Historians were quick to point out the many liberties the film took with the real events, but even its critics tended to acknowledge that it had gotten a new audience genuinely curious about ancient history, even if the movie itself was closer to myth than documentary. For Hollywood, the lesson of 300 was simpler and more commercial. A film without major stars, shot almost entirely inside a studio against blue screens, could become a genuine box office phenomenon if the visual identity was strong enough and the commitment behind the camera and in front of it was total. It opened doors for Zack Snyder to take on larger, more ambitious projects in the years that followed, and it fundamentally changed the trajectory of Gerard Butler's career, transforming him almost overnight from a working actor with scattered credits into a recognizable leading man. Before 300, Butler had built a solid but unremarkable resume, supporting turns and mid-tier leads in films that showcased his range without ever quite breaking him into the top tier of working actors. His performance as King Leonidas changed that almost instantly. The physical presence he brought to the role, backed by the punishing preparation and his own willingness to absorb real risk for the sake of authenticity, gave audiences a performance that felt genuinely lived in rather than performed at arm's length, and Hollywood responded accordingly. In the years that followed, Butler moved fluidly between genres in a way that suggested studios saw him as more than just an action figure. He took on romantic drama, stepping opposite Hilary Swank in a story that leaned entirely on emotional vulnerability rather than physical spectacle. He returned to grittier territory in a crime drama directed by Guy Ritchie, then dove into a dark revenge thriller that let him explore a far more morally complicated character than the noble warrior king that had made him famous. He found comfortable footing in romantic comedy as well, appearing alongside major stars in films that kept him firmly in the public eye even outside the action genre. Still, it was the action hero identity that 300 had cemented that continued to define the shape of his career most consistently. He returned to historical spectacle years later, took on large-scale disaster filmmaking, and eventually anchored a long-running franchise as a hardened Secret Service agent across multiple installments, building a loyal audience that came to expect a certain rugged reliability from him on screen. Alongside those bigger commercial swings, he continued taking on smaller, more personal projects that let him stretch as an actor away from the spotlight of a blockbuster budget. Looking back at it now, it's clear that 300 didn't just give Gerard Butler a memorable role. It gave him a template for how he'd approach nearly everything that came after. The willingness to physically commit, to chase authenticity even when it came at real personal cost, and to treat preparation as inseparable from performance all trace back to those months in Montreal, sweating under studio lights, bleeding for a role that would define the rest of his career. Whatever else he goes on to do, there's a good chance he'll always, on some level, be measured against the man who stood on that ledge and roared at an army that outnumbered him 1,000 to 1. So now that you know what actually went into building that legend, the hospital visits, the 7 months of grueling training, the torn rotator cuff, the brotherhood forged in shared exhaustion, does it change how you see the film? Knowing what Butler and the rest of the cast actually went through behind the scenes, does 300 hit differently the next time you watch it? Let us know what you think in the comments.